Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome you to a new edition of Living Word Live. Thank you for joining us during this particular transmission. We hope you'll stick around because I have this gut feeling that the topic in and of itself will be not only rather controversial, but will pique a lot of attention. Some of you may say, well, it seems as if the titling for this particular episode is intentionally controversial. Well, it's not intentionally controversial if you
was.
we would never do such a thing. The fact of the matter is that we are killing quite a few cultural sacred cows during this edition, but that's with all intention, because if we're going to see things through the light of Scripture and against what the secular culture teaches against God's truth, then it is necessary to attract attention in this way and dispel those very myths. Joining me once again, my name is Gio. For this edition of the Living Word live stream is my father Jesus, which, as you'll notice, his voice has not been necessarily cooperating. He's getting better. I may speak a bit more than usual during this edition because we're trying to do everything we can to salvage his vocal cords.
I will be using sign language. So we've had complaints about doing the program in English. Imagine now.
Exactly. So for those of you that have been writing and asking us how has he been doing, because we had a bit of a scare the other day with his health. Obviously he's here with us and he's recuperating slowly but surely, and we thank God for that. But as I said, we're trying to salvage his vocal cords. But I know you wanted to be here for this one because this topic is something that is important.
This is something that I enjoy talking about and helping people with.
Absolutely. We're going to talk about the myth of mental health. Now, it's important for us to address, firstly, the remonstrations, the retorts, and the challenges that people will put forth when we say the myth of mental health, because most people accept it as a thing that is based on veracity. There is undeniable proof, some will say, that mental health is in fact a thing that can be put forth and that people can be helped out with, because mental illness is the thing that happens to plague many people, and we can fix that and provide mental health via, some will say, therapies, some will say drugs, some will say other interventions, and culture has widely accepted it to be true.
It's acceptable today. So I can recall when psychology started getting popular, and most of the kids going to college wanted at least some of their classes to take up the subject.
Yeah.
But science itself, medicine itself, used to say things like psychology, that's quackery.
Yep.
And so they have done a great job. You have to tip your hat, using propaganda to lead the people to where they are now, where it's common to talk about mental health. He's got mental health issues, and all of a sudden there's a whole array available to the person that has mental health issues to get help. Of course, they tapped into insurance money and into federal laws that have been written, and now you find it everywhere, in schools, in our courts, in family counseling, in divorce proceedings. It's everywhere.
They're experts about anything and everything. You know what I find interesting in all of this? Well, there's a lot of interesting things, dynamics that are at play here, because now you have police officers, especially the corrupt kind. You've seen videos of them being recorded by citizens whom they understand that they're dealing with corrupt cops. And one of the things that these police officers ask these motor vehicle drivers is, "Are you okay?" And people who know their rights, what do you mean by that? I'm doing a well-being check. This is very curious to me that now people whom supposedly are given the task of serving and protecting, at least that's the guys, now they fancy themselves
like cops,
right,
serving and protecting.
Exactly. Now they fancy themselves to also be psychologists, because now everybody seems to be an expert in psychology, where the fact of the matter is that they have no idea where its provenance is.
Right.
They have no idea what its doctrines are.
Right.
It's just culturally accepted as if psychology is one of those fields. And among conservatives and Christians in particular, Jordan B. Peterson has been one of these whom has normalized that, especially in that circle which originally had rejected the quackery.
And Dobson.
Oh, you're right.
You have to place a lot of the, What word are we going to use to place at the feet of Dobson?
Yeah. He helped
popularized it
he did.
amongst Christians.
It's funny.
And there's a quote up there, I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
let's go.
by Dobson saying, "This is dangerous," talking about psychology, but if you think this is a field that you would like to make your profession out of, then by all means. But he did call it dangerous.
That you and I knew, we'll call them compatriots in ministry, whom years ago had begun to write about psychology and its infiltration into the church, which, by the way, credit where credit is due, J. Vernon McGee, when psychology began to creep its way into the church, was one of the more popular voices out there saying, be careful with what you're taking in, because I think the quote is, this will destroy biblical teaching in churches. And he was absolutely right about
and the
matter.
Bobgans have been tremendously helpful.
Yes.
Psychoheresy awareness.
Martin and Deidre Bobgan.
That is
absolutely.
correct.
If I'm not mistaken, they're
Highly recommend their books.
yes, yeah. Mind you, they offer a psychoheresy awareness. You can visit their website, and they actually offer a lot of their resources for free, which is absolutely fantastic. But here's the interesting thing about this. I remember that you and I, we had a chance to speak with I guess we can call him a beloved brother in Christ. He's gone on to be with the Lord now, Dave Hunt. And we invited him a few times to church. And
Yes,
he told us about when he started speaking out against psychology, and he started mentioning in The Seduction of Christianity. That book was pretty popular. He mentions Dobson by name, and he says, this guy is actually promoting heresy within the church. I was told, and I'm not going to say by who, but I was informed that they got called to the carpet over that one, that Dobson wanted to see him and wanted to he demanded to know, why are you denouncing me in public? And the pressure was put on in order to get him to renounce the things that he had written. And Dave said, this is stuff that you've said. This is the stuff that you've taught. I'm not going to simply renounce what I've written about this, which is true, simply because it decimates your image in some way, shape, or form, right?
That book is full of quotes from others. And so if Hunt was lying, all they had to do was sue him.
Absolutely.
Never happened.
Never happened. Let me ask the audience this, because I know this is something that we have to attack from the very onset. Because this is an attitude that I think it's important for us to just absolutely destroy the foundations of whatever building this thing is built upon. Because now everybody fancies themselves an expert until you directly contradict what they believe, the falsehoods that they've espoused, with facts, and then they begin to challenge you with, and this was very popular during COVID, and it continues to be so, are you an expert in that? Curious, from the very same people whom are not experts on these things, they're asking you rhetorically whether or not you're an expert on the matter.
When it's on one side of the coin, because on the other side of the coin, you have people saying Christians are always judging each other. And what shall we call them, the sinners, carnal Christians, and the rest are always judging each other via psychobabble.
Absolutely.
Don't analyze me anymore.
Absolutely.
I can't help myself. I took a course in humanities.
That's right. Said course in humanities, of course, in the college, in the universities, will always disguise what Freud and his disciples. And let me say this. I know there are going to be people whom are going to write us. You guys don't know what you're talking about. Psychology has distanced itself from Freud. Psychologists themselves, whom have actually studied the thing, have said there is no way to distance the foundational aspects of psychotherapy, psychology, whatever you may call it, from Freud and his disciples. There is a direct link between what he taught and what is being taught today, which is something that we will eventually discuss.
And for the longest time, folks, right at the top of the list of people that decide I want to take my own life are the shrinks.
Well, you and I, you have made this joke throughout the years, which I find pretty funny. If you could summarize Freud's prescriptions for absolutely every single malady that his so-called patients would have, what was it essentially?
I'm going to start laughing, then I'm going to start coughing, so you deal with it.
Let's see. You think you've got cocaine for that would be very good. What? You said you have this particular cocaine for that would be very good. Constipation, you know what? X amount of dosage of cocaine for that would be good. Cocaine seemed to be the thing that he would recommend for anything and every malady in the book.
And the other good joke on this, let's see if I can keep it together here, was the guy that goes to see his therapist, and he says, Doc, I think I've got a split personality. There's like another person living inside me. Doc says, go ahead and sit down, and all four of us will have a conversation.
That's a great way to bring up the point that, what Dad says is absolutely true. When you look at the professions in the United States, at the very least, where suicide is the highest, head shrinks. It's funny because they don't even like, when you call them a head shrink, they absolutely detest it. They've always detested that. Now, let me ask the audience, or those of you more particularly whom may rebuff what we are saying here at the onset, that we need to provide proof that mental illness and mental health, these concepts are inherently a myth. Because, as you may say, the proof is everywhere. And look how much psychology, psychotherapy, and the pharmaceutical industry is helping out people with these mental disturbances. 4 questions. Number 1, is your belief in mental illness and health substantiated by empirical evidence or by societal normalization and fiat? You know why we ask this question? Because the people whom say that they, without a shadow of a doubt, understand that mental health is a concept to be understood and to be helped out with, they know nothing of the studies. They don't do any investigative work to see whom are the peddlers of these psychobabalistic ideas. They simply accept it because, as we'll discuss shortly, mental health and mental illness, the concepts themselves, are a very convenient way to get away with things that in the past society simply would not let you get away with.
Chief, amongst these things that are destroyed via the doctrines that belong to psychology is the fact that God created us and we are a triune being. And psychology, very astutely, in essence, tells you there is no inner man.
Right.
So that's something that I know we'll tackle a little further on tonight, but keep that one in mind because it's a very, very important issue and a point that believers should at least pause and say, wait a minute, is this something that psychology is telling me?
Yep.
Without really using the words that will reveal, show their hand.
Exactly. Well, I keep referring back to that instance where you and I were present with a person who considers himself a theologian, and his daughter said to us, I don't need to read history to know. It's the same thing with many people within culture now who they'll tell you, I know mental illness is a thing and I know mental health is a thing because I dealt with it.
You need to finish that one though. I don't need to read history to know history.
Yeah, that's well, the thing is, we had a very lively debate, to say the least, about John Calvin and the way that he ran Geneva as a tyrant. And I asked her point blank range, do you know anything about history? I mean, you have to understand that in order to understand history, you have to know about it, you have to read about it, you have to inform yourself about it. I don't need to read history to know anything about it.
She uses her time machine.
Yeah, exactly. The DeLorean, by the way. She's got access to the DeLorean. So the question, you have to ask yourself that question, do you actually know any of the particular studies? Do you know where the provenance of said studies is? Do you know who funds those particular studies and whom are the people that are putting forth this information? Why? Because vested interests are a very, very powerful incentive for organizations and people to put forth and endorse ideas when they're inherently damaging to the public. Number 2, can you prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that the mind, notice the words that we're using here, the mind, I did not say brain, I said mind, which by definition points to an intangible spiritual part of man, the mind, can become physically ill. Because the phrase mental health is an oxymoron when you think about it. When we're talking about health, we're talking about the physical man. See, the body can become sick, you can become ill, I can become ill, but the mind, when we're talking about that intangible part of the human being where the Bible talks to us about spirit, soul, mind, those things cannot be physically ill because they are not tangible, so to speak. They are an intangible. They are part of the spirit of man. Gio, but this is just, I know what some will say, Gio, but necessarily when we're talking about sickness, It's just a word that we use to describe what is ailing man, spiritually speaking. But then the question begs to be asked. Why use the term illness or sickness instead of what we used to call it? Sin, depravity, inclinations towards that of evil. Oh no, but there's another point, Dad, in all of this. Psychology specifically, and Freud did this with all intention because his writings are available on it, and Carl Jung and others wrote about this as well. We need to distance ourselves from biblical lingo that describes human behavior. We need to propose new language that gets us to a secular humanist understanding of how man essentially is. And that's why it's become part and parcel of modern society to use these oxymoronic phrases, and doesn't seem like anybody really notices.
Well, the neurosurgeon, Wilder Penfield, he clearly explained that the mind and the brain are two different things. Of course, he paid a price for that.
Sure.
This guy was well known, and he went on to explain the differences. And of course, the way we would explain it today is that you can have the hard disk, but you need the software. And so say that all things, emotions, intellect, everything, the capacity to love, which if we have time, I want to tackle the first commandment, because it says there, thou shalt love the Lord with all your heart,
Mind,
with all your soul,
yep,
mind, and strength.
and strength.
And notice, folks, that all these four parts belong to the inner man, and all four are capable of loving. You shall love, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so when you take time, when you sit down, relax, and look at the verse is telling you can love with all four. And so you can have the hard disk, you can have the CPU, but you need the software.
Sure.
And when we're talking about the software, we're talking about the inner man. And this is something that Freud and others that followed him, even though there's conflict in the things they taught you. Because you have this very popular shrink. Way back then, he was popular already. And he's basically saying, following Freud's lead, yeah, everything is in the brain, but he's got a spirit guide, Philemon.
Talking about Carl Jung.
That's right.
Which is one of Jordan B. Peterson's idols, my understanding.
And so you ask yourself, how can this guy
He
be
said
teaching
he interacted with him. He even wrote a little red book of his interactions with this.
in relationships
Oh, yeah.
with his patients?
Yeah. Learn from Freud.
I mean, the things that are kept from most students about psychiatry and psychology are enough to damn these studies, but they've managed to keep people's eyes away from all the information. And all of a sudden, when you and I bring this topic to the forefront, the first thing they say is, what, are you guys experts? And this is why we quote people like experts like Wilder Penfield, who said, wait a minute, they've got this wrong.
But the people, as we said earlier, that would think that that is in essence an argument, that rhetorical question, they themselves are not experts. They simply cling to these things because they think it convenient for them. And then when someone brings along evidence that demonstrates that the notions that they've grasped onto are essentially faulty. Look, no one likes to be told that they're wrong. It just hits you in your pride. But guess what? The Bible says that wisdom is taking that pride, doing away with it, and listening to correction so as to put a man in his way in God's footsteps.
The other thing that happens with psychology is they know where humans enjoy existing. And we, in our fallen nature, enjoy blaming others.
Mm-hmm.
That's the very first thing that Adam and Eve did. The woman you gave me. The serpent you left here in the garden. And so psychology will always tell you it's society, it's it's your mom, your dad, both of them.
Because that's what Freud taught. You're the result of your environment. It's everybody else's fault.
Humans like this.
Exactly.
And this is another way of pulling you away from God, because God says you have to be responsible for your doings.
Exactly.
I make you responsible. I hold you responsible for your doings.
Absolutely correct. It's a curious thing that you're mentioning this, because Freud was the originator. This is why there's a direct link between modern psychology and Freud. No matter how much psychologists will say we've disowned many of the teachings of Freud, which, by the way, I know what some people will write to us and say, well, Gio, you said earlier that Freud was the originator of the idea that man's inclinations, his emotions, his thoughts, things that sprout from the inner man, that's just a result of biological fizzing, so to speak. In reality, Freud spoke about the id, the ego, and the superego, and the subconscious, and things of that nature. Let me ask you all a question. Was Freud actually able to prove any of these things? You see, you had to take it on his authority, which, by the way, I would also blame Freud for actually taking biblical concepts, twisting them, contorting them into this newfangled idea that arises against what the text says against these things. Because at the very least, we would have to say that Freud had to admit, he never admitted it openly, but he had to admit by using these scurrilous phrases like the id, the superego, and things of that nature, that man does have an inner man that drives all of his behavior. He just proposed new language for an understanding of it because of his contempt for Christianity, which we have a quote that will prove that. What was it that he said? That religion, and he specifically pointed out Christianity, was the opiate of the masses, just like Marx believed and others. So it's a very curious thing that Freud himself would use these phrases, but then we have quotes where he says that man has been formed by his environment, by simple biological processes, and people would actually deny that this is what he taught and this is what he taught his disciples.
And even in all the denials and in his war against God, if you look into the things he said, the things he wrote, you can tell he stole from the Word of God.
Oh, yeah.
Because the Bible teaches us, folks, that we come to this world defective, and through correction and teaching and admonishment and discipline, these things are held in check. And so, as I have read through many of the things that he wrote, and not just Freud, but Jung and others, Adler and others, you can tell they stole from God.
Oh, sure.
And they twisted it. They adulterated these things. And in doing so, now the new mentality, the new way to educate and to help man and mankind came along, and we have the results right in front of our eyes.
Yeah, isn't it interesting also how the psychologists themselves, like Freud and on, they posited the idea. Adler was one of the huge proponents of this with his so-called medical experiments on animals, and how they said, if we can get animals to change their behavior via, let's say, electroshock therapy and things of that nature, maybe we can make man do the exact same thing. Very curious that psychology is directly responsible because there's a link between corporations, government, NGOs, and news media and others whom said, maybe we can take these ideas put forward by Freud, by Jung, by Adler, by Rogers, and others, and we can change public perception and we can change public behavior by just changing the environment and putting forth certain stimuli. They got these ideas from these persons.
Not only to get you to buy the merchandise, purchase the service, but turn your workers into working ants.
Exactly.
Worker ants.
Exactly. Genesis, Dieter, she puts forth something very interesting. I'd like to read it and address it. It says, it's also interesting to think about how there's no evidence that talk therapy alone without behavioral interventions serves to assist people in their so-called mental health ailments. It's a very good observation because I would have a bit of homework for the audience. If you have an opportunity, there's a YouTube video. I don't have the link to it immediately, but I'm pretty sure that a simple search will help you find it. Where Carl Rogers, who was considered the preeminent psychologist of the 20th century, he allows certain cameras to go into his practice and record him engaging in psychotherapy. And there's a woman whom, and using this as an example of how psychology can help people. And there's a woman that goes into his office and begins to explain to him the mental ailments that she's going through. The essence of his responses for about 45 minutes is, what do you think about that? Okay, how do you interpret that? You should read the comments. Fantastic intervention. Unbelievable what this guy has done for this woman. And I'm sitting there, I know you've seen the video, we're sitting there watching this and said, this guy basically just threw everything back at her, gave her no solutions whatsoever, and these people are interpreting this man to be some sort of, snake oil salesman? Like he's actually helping with when he's done nothing. Again, there's a reason why people whom have criticized psychology throughout the years call it the talk therapy, because that's in essence what it comes down to.
Here's a couple films. I don't think I've ever done this before, but if you want to have an interesting time, And then after the films are over, have a conversation or two with your family. Here's a couple of films that you might want to see. What about Bob?
That's a good film.
Is that the name of the film?
That's
What
a
about
good
Bob?
film.
And then the other one is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
That's right. Raise your hands to the ceiling, Chief.
And if you can look beyond some of the funny things that happen, there is a message behind these films that I think it'd be interesting if you and your family took a couple of hours to take a look at these films, because I think there's commentary that was placed within these films that it's a backhanded slap, if you will, at the industry. And it is an industry, by the way. And the way they have managed now to find a way, and not only a way, but the way they have found a way to establish themselves in society. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Dr. Dideen, I forget her name.
Tana Dineen.
Tana Dineen.
Manufacturing Victims.
You have to read that.
You can obtain that book for free, by the way. I've got a copy of it. She's making it available via PDF.
You have to read that book.
Psychologist. She herself is a psychologist.
If this is something that interests you, and it should, especially young people that are ready to have a family, start a family, you need to understand what is going on in the schools and how the kids are being bombarded. A lot of teachers don't know. They don't have a clue as to where the material that they are feeding their kids, teaching their kids come from. You need to educate yourself to make sure that you keep your kids, you keep your family away from this stuff. Because once it traps you, then it gets so deep inside your soul that people all of a sudden feel a call to the ministry, and you sit there and you listen to those sermons and you go like, that's not Bible, that's psychobabble. A fellow from Houston tends to do that quite a bit.
Quite a bit. And he also has a tendency to tell people that have gone through our tragedy, God is in control. Very interesting.
You're my champion.
You're my champion. Number 3 and number 4. Folks, we might have to extend this to the Sunday edition, because we've got plenty of other things we'd like to share with the audience. And there's quite a few things we'd also like to mention. But let's see how it continues to go. Number 3, third question. Wherein does the Bible, we are speaking to Christians, and by any extension, God, claim that the mind can become sick? You're not going to be able to find it. And then number 4, do you have absolute knowledge where the concept of mental health and mental illness actually comes from? If your honest answers, and hopefully those are your honest answers, are, well, the latter, no, can't say to all 4 questions, then it would be advisable to pay attention to those that have actually studied the matter and listen to what they have to say on the matter. Now, here's the thing. I know some will say that's rather arrogant of you guys to say that about yourselves. Well, we can say this with all confidence because this is something that we've actually spent years studying. And not only have we spent years studying, we've actually spoken to people whom are inside the industry and have actively told us of the things that they have seen with their own eyes. People who themselves have seen the abuses, and they have become outcasts from the industry and from the profession because of their denunciations.
Look at what they've done with kids.
Exactly.
Or 2 kids. To the point that when they first started treating young children with medication for mental illness, they were giving them doses that are today only appropriate for adults. And it was during the Clinton administration that they said, wait a minute, we have to pull back on the doses because this is harming the kids. There are a lot of kids out there today. The minute they show a little too much energy, they have to go to the counselor. Mom and dad have to come in. We think we should start medicating your child because he seems to have these problems. And the reality is that this is just a normal child with a lot of energy to burn, and these teachers don't know what to do with these kids.
That's another thing that we can talk about is how the DSM, when it began, I think in the 1960s, there were supposedly, 112 mental disorders. Now it's upwards of 357.
And they haven't studied you and I
yet. Well, what is it that
once they do that, they'll find what 6, 8, 10
probably
dozen?
they'll throw the book at us, so to speak. Well, what is it that psychologists will typically say? Your average person has about 2 or 3 mental illnesses each.
Yeah.
Interesting. I'd like to read this quote for the audience because I did promise it to the audience. I don't want to leave you in suspense. Moses and monotheism. Curious. This is a writing from Sigmund Freud, 1939. For anybody whom says there is no direct correlation between what Freud taught and modern psychology, quote, religion is an attempt to get control over the sensory world in which we are placed by means of the wish world, which we have developed inside us as a result of biological and psychological necessities. Shall I repeat this?
Please.
I think it'd be important that we do. Religion is
Brilliant.
Brilliant. Religion is an attempt to get control over the sensory world in which we are placed by means of the wish world, which by the way, you have to ask Freud, what did he mean by the wish world? How did he know about this? Freud had a lot of it. When you have an opportunity, we would encourage the audience to look up the so-called Oedipus complex and see specifically what Freud taught about young men and their mothers. I think you'd be rather disgusted by it.
I love my mom.
Yes. And not loving in a familial way, but rather sexual inclination. Yes, that's what he taught. Religion is an attempt to get control over the sensory world in which we are placed by means of the wish world, which we have developed inside us as a result of biological and psychological necessities, but it cannot achieve its end. Its doctrines carry with them the stamp of the times in which they originated, the ignorant childhood days of the human race. Its consolations deserve no trust. The opposite is we trust Freud and his times and the times in which his ideas originated and so on and so forth.
We should play this. We should place that stuff on our coins. In Freud we trust.
In Freud we trust.
Remember when Trump won the presidency and shrinks started to do what they've always said you should never do. They started to analyze from a distance.
Yes.
This guy's mentally sick. He's a wacko. Now that we have somebody in desperate need of help, they don't dare analyze this guy.
I wonder why.
Furthermore, they lie to us. And this is why, I recommend these films. What About Bob and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? Because these people will lie to you right in your face. Just think of it this way, folks, please. There's a trial going on, and both sides are going to present expert witnesses. The prosecutor brings up an expert, a psychologist, and he'll say, no, nothing wrong with this guy. He's just a cold-blooded murderer. The defense brings up their expert witnesses. This guy is sick. This guy's a wacko. You cannot send this guy to prison. You must put him in a mental institution until he can get better because he has no idea what he did. Well, how can they get it so completely different, the one from the other?
Correct.
Because there are hundreds and hundreds of therapies and ways to analyze and different conclusions. So we are talking about a wacky, wacky world. And this happens every day in this country, and people are not aware of it.
Absolutely.
Bring up your next witness. I'd like to have understand Dr. So-and-so. He has analyzed everything from the highest intellectuals that we have on earth to ants. Yes, yes.
They've sat on his couch. And they ask, why do I have to work all day?
Exactly.
Someone left a comment, says, hi, Pastor Gio. I can attest to this because I've personally gone through talk therapy and it got me nowhere in the end. Let me say this to conclude this particular edition. I agree with you, and I'm glad that you can attest to this. But here's the thing. There are people that are convinced that these so-called talk therapies will actually help them, or that these drugs like the SSRIs that they're giving that have a litany of side effects and have even ended up killing people, to the point where people have had suicidal tendencies and whatnot, and they've attested that when they finally got off the drugs, they were just perfectly fine. There are people that are convinced that these so-called talk therapies are actually helping them and that these SSRIs and other drugs, pharmaceuticals that they're giving out are actually helping, when in fact all the opposite is true. Why? Because, as we said earlier, psychotherapy is inherently an indoctrinating religion, but people don't have a tendency to see it that way.
That's true.
So you have to be very careful with that. I certainly am glad that you've come to that conclusion because it is true. But psychotherapy also has a very, very, shall we say, cunning and manipulative way of making you believe that they're actually helping you when in fact they are actually doing things to your detriment. This is why we said what we said at the beginning of this transmission, that we knew that there would be people, and pretty sure we're going to get the letters eventually, that will say, you guys are wrong, you guys don't know what you're talking about, et cetera, because they have been connived rather, that they've been helped out when in fact all the opposite is true.
Plus now you're tapping their money.
Good point.
Because many of them are saying if somehow this becomes popular, then people won't come to me anymore. And they can get pretty upset, Gio.
I saw a debate today in preparation for this. Sadly, we weren't able to talk about it, but there was a debate that happened about 7 years ago in Britain where the proposal was put forth to the audience. And it says, we are an over-medicated, overdose society, and the people partly responsible for this are the pharmaceutical companies, the psychologists, and the psychiatrists. And they had two people on both sides arguing, one in favor, one against. Curiously enough, those that were arguing against the proposition, one of them worked for Pfizer. The other guy was receiving grants from the pharmaceutical industry behind the scenes, and he wouldn't disclose it. Thankfully, there was someone in the audience that got up, and even though he was speaking as a disinterested party and all of this in favor of the psychological industry and the pharmaceutical industry and whatnot, he says, I've done the studies on you. I know that you've received money from them. No, I haven't. Yes, I have. I'm a researcher. I'm a university professor. I know that you received money. That's an outright lie. And they tried to hide it. You want to hear the interesting thing about it? When given a vote, 52% of the audience actually ended up believing those that were defending psychology and psychotherapy and psychiatry and the pill taking, the drug, the pharmaceuticals and whatnot, even though the opposite group, the duo that were speaking out against it, they gave more than enough evidence to talk about how dangerous this is, how this has led to people having their lives taken away and whatnot. Most people said, no, we agree with the opposite assertion that this is actually helpful for society. The only thing I can conclude is there was plenty of people, 52% of that audience, they're probably medicated. They probably believe in all this garbage. And that's why no matter what the evidence was showcasing, they said, we still want to affirm the opposite.
Of course, if you're being treated, you don't want to admit, I've been duped. Many years ago, Phil Donahue, he had the talk show on TV.
Jerry Springer, before Jerry Springer was Jerry Springer.
He brought this guy on who basically tried to convince people, they were duping people, that people with blue eyes, light eyes, they were evil, they were bad. When he started presenting his theory, they were laughing at him. By the end of the show, he had most people convinced that people with light eyes, blue, green eyes, had done evil, wronged them. They were bad people. And then he said, none of this that I have said is true. Look how easily you've been duped. How easily I have managed to convince you to believe something that is just not true. And so once you embrace this, and once you see it as your profession and your own little way of saying, we can replace God. We don't need God to help our fellow man. What is this thing about sin and man being weak? Of course not. We just need to help each other with a little conversation. Of course, we'll listen to your conversation, and then when we finally talk, we'll tell you exactly who to blame so you can feel better about yourself. That's basically the way it goes.
That's basically what's the question that we've asked throughout the years? If according to psychology, you're not to blame, everyone else is to blame, I guess everybody then is to blame, because if you're not to blame for what you have done to yourself, then you're to blame for what you did to somebody else. Well, folks, that's all the time that we have left for this edition. By the way, we want to thank all of the comments, the well wishes that the commentators have left here.
Much.
We thank you so much for that. We remind you of a couple of things. We were able to debut our new website, livingwordlive.substack.com. We would encourage you to subscribe to that website. One of the beauties of Substack is that whenever we post content, you will be alerted automatically through email. And then there will be links provided and whatnot for you to access that particular content. But that's one of the beauties of it. We are posting our podcast episodes there. We're posting the writings that Dad is posting on there and some other things. So if you have not yet subscribed, we would encourage you to do so. Again, visit livingwordlive.substack.com. Input your email address. We won't bombard your inbox with spam. It's just to alert you as to whenever we post new content for your edification. If you prefer, or in addition to the Substack subscription, you can also subscribe to our Telegram channel. The username is Living Word Live, as you'll find in the screen beneath. And finally, we would ask you 2 additional things. Share this information with other people so that they too may know the goodness of God's grace and they may be freed from the deception of this secular age, and also help us economically. It is through your patronage, it is through your donations that we can continue to put out this content for your edification and for the protection of the inner man against the assault that currently stands against the Word of God by this secular culture. The link is beneath the video player in the description box below. We will gather once again for our next live stream, which will be Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's all the time that we have left for this edition. I want to thank you all once again for viewing and also for the well wishes. Until the next occasion that we meet, may the Lord shine his face upon you.